From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
President Biden stands by his red line, withholding additional weapons for Israel ahead of a possible invasion of Rafah. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel will stand alone against Hamas if needed. We'll speak with Evelyn Farkas of the McCain Institute.
Stormy Daniels back on the stand in Donald Trump's hush money trial in New York today, ending 2 days of salacious testimony. We'll discuss whether she helped or hurt the prosecution's case, as well as the political reaction, coming up with our panel.
And with President Biden taking his campaign to California today, we'll examine what the results of the 2024 election may mean for investors with Libby Cantrill of Pimco. So much to discuss this evening, Joe, but now almost a full 24 hours later, the conversation that is dominating discourse here in Washington is what we heard from President Biden last night in regard to Israel-Rafah and what weapons the U.S. will or will not be willing to provide. Yeah, and that still remains unclear, I guess, as the administration reviews the word that they're using, planned shipments of weapons to Israel, not to be confused with the supplemental emergency funding bill that the president recently signed into law. This became news in an interview last evening on CNN as the president was asked about his policy in Israel. Here he is.
Supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities, to deal with that problem. We're going to continue to make sure Israel is secure in terms of Iron Dome and their ability to respond to attacks. But I've made it clear to Bibi and the War Cabinet, they're not going to get our support if, in fact, they go in these population centers.
Joining us now for more, our Bloomberg panel this evening, Bloomberg's Gregory Cordy and Kate Ackley of Bloomberg Government. Thank you both so much for being here. So, Gregory, first to you. Obviously, this is a president who has been under immense political pressure, especially from his left flank of the Democratic Party, to do more to protect Palestinian life in Gaza. Certainly, the campus protests we have seen in recent weeks is evidence of that. Now he has brought on even more pressure from the right over this decision. There is no winning for him in this scenario.
Yeah, if you look at the coalition that elected Biden in 2020, it was obviously mostly Democrats, but he won some independents and even some Never Trump Republicans because he was running against Donald Trump. And that coalition is fraying at the edges. And this is the perfect example of that, where if he's going to keep the progressive wing of his party, especially younger voters who are very concerned about what they see going on in Gaza, that might alienate some of the people on the right of his coalition who have still stalwartly support Israel.
I want to go back to what the president said to CNN, because I think we missed a couple of words at the beginning of his statement. If they go into Rafah, he said, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah. Gregory, is this a change in policy, or is this just open diplomacy, using, in this case, the media for this platform?
Yeah, so this comes just days after that Congress approved a new aid package for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan, about $18 billion for Israel alone. And Congress obviously approved that spending with the expectation that it would go very quickly to help Israel in this war against Gaza. What the president's saying is, look, and you get this issue with many of these proxy wars, is what kind of aid are you going to give? In terms of munitions, are they offensive weapons or are they defensive weapons? The president's saying Iron Dome, that very sophisticated system that can prevent air attacks like the ones that we saw from Iran recently, that's still something that we want to support. But the bombs and the artillery that could be used and could have a high potential for civilian casualties in Gaza is not something that he wants to support. And so that's the message to the Israeli War Cabinet in terms of change how you approach this campaign in Gaza, or else we can't support it.
Well, it's worth pointing out that supplemental funding, to your point, is replenishment for defensive operations, including the Iron Dome. That is where all those billions of dollars were intended to go. But of course, there has still been a lot of ire in Congress over President Biden's decision, especially from Republican members, including the congressman from Wisconsin, Brian Stile, who spoke with us earlier today on Bloomberg.
The president made the wrong move in trying to prevent that shipment of weapons that are authorized by the United States House of Representatives, the Senate, and the president himself from being able to be distributed. The action by the president is actually a step in the complete wrong direction.
And Kate, we've also heard from the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, who suggested President Biden maybe was having a senior moment in saying this in his interview last night. And you've even had calls from some in the Republican Party, including from Senator Tom Cotton, for the House to impeach Biden over this.
I've seen some pretty strong rhetoric, like you're saying, and I think Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, I think his statement today was basically this is going to help Hamas. You know, this is the president being pro-Hamas, if you will. So some really charged rhetoric has been, continues to be injected into this debate. But it's not just Republicans that have criticized the president over this. You saw some of the Democrats who have taken a strong pro-Israel stance, like Senator John Fetterman, a Democrat of Pennsylvania, who has really been very pro-Israel since the October 7th massacres there. And, he said that he disagreed with the president about this. So it isn't just a matter of Republicans piling on, a president of a different party, but you're seeing even some divisions continuing within the president's own party.
We heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu earlier today, released a video on X saying in part, "Today we are much stronger, we are determined, and we are united in order to defeat our enemies and those who want to destroy us. If we need to stand alone, we will stand alone." Gregory, if that is the outcome here, then does Joe Biden lose on both sides? Getting back to where Kayleigh started this discussion, he's already upset progressives. If Benjamin Netanyahu is going to go ahead with what he's doing anyway, what's the point of all this?
Yeah, well, we'll have to see, because immediately after posting that on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, he gave an interview to Dr. Phil McGraw of TV fame, of all people, saying a little bit more conciliatory remarks, saying, look, Joe Biden and I have been friends for 40 years. Yeah. We're going to work this out. I trust that we can figure out an accommodation here. But he still is obviously very hawkish in how he's going to approach this war. And nothing short of eliminating every single last Hamas fighter is going to be satisfying to him. And I think that's President Biden's goal as well, but also understanding that there are these civilian issues that need to be addressed by whatever war plan Israel comes up with.
So obviously this is a large headache for the incumbent president and one who is seeking re-election in November. But the man he's running against has some headaches of his own. Donald Trump in court in New York again today. He actually left without saying anything to the cameras, which is a bit unusual, differing from what we've seen so far in the few weeks of this trial. But Gregory, this was a second day of testimony from Stormy Daniels. A lot of cross-examination today as the defense questions her description of her encounter with Trump, the sexual encounter specifically, getting into various details. Is this something that ultimately her testimony could backfire on the prosecution and backfire on the idea that this was going to potentially hurt Trump politically?
Yeah, this was supposed to be a case, at least legally, that was all about whether or not Trump and the Trump Organization falsified business records to cover up hush money payments to Stormy Daniels. But for a case that's ostensibly about the paperwork, we've spent an awful lot of time going into the really sordid details about what happened in that hotel room in 2006. And, of course, that's what's going to capture the popular imagination. There's no television cameras in that courtroom, so that might blunt the political impact. But certainly late-night comics, news programs like this one, it's sensational testimony, and you really can't ignore it. And it's something that I think, when we talk about the character question, it's something that the American people are going to have to decide whether or not they believe Stormy Daniels, whether they believe Donald Trump, and if they do believe one or the other, how that should factor into their vote in November.
All the while, Donald Trump continues to hold sway over the Republican conference in the House. And after, at this time yesterday, when you were walking us live through this motion to vacate exercise with Marjorie Taylor Greene, many thought that the Speaker of the House was in the clear. He survived this attempted ouster. Then Donald Trump goes on Truth Social and writes, with a majority of one shortly growing to 3 or 4, we're not in a position of voting on a motion to vacate. At some point, we may very well be. So to what extent does he continue to drive the agenda in the House?
Oh, I think to a large extent. I mean, there's been numerous examples where you see Republicans in Congress, sort of taking their marching orders, if you will, from former President Trump. And I think as the campaigns heat up and we get into campaign season and things on Capitol Hill sort of grind to a halt anyway, just naturally when everybody's out on the campaign trail, I think there's going to be a lot of taking cues from Trump, even given the scandals that are, you're just talking about with the testimony today and this week. He continues to be this dominant force in particularly in the Republican side of the aisle.
So the influence has certainly not changed, even through the course of this trial. Kate Ackley, great to have you, along with Gregory Cordy. A great conversation from our reporters tonight. Coming up, we'll take a deeper dive on the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Evelyn Farkas of the McCain Institute at Arizona State University will join us next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and Radio.
I'm concerned that in some way it demonstrates to Hamas that they are winning the PR war and things. And also, the president cares about the casualties, innocents in Gaza, and Hamas doesn't. I mean, that's part of the plan. So they are exploiting compassion.
This will not embolden Hamas in any way. What it will do is make it clear that as you go after Hamas, don't create more civilian casualties, because Hamas is actually benefiting from the fact that the humanitarian crisis is so bad. So what the president has done is say we're going to use the tools at our disposal to achieve the president's own objectives.
Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, as well John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, speaking earlier with Bloomberg, reacting to the decision by President Biden to limit military aid to Israel if, in fact, the invasion of Rafah begins. Earlier today, I spoke with Kelly Grieco of the Stimson Center about the high-stakes maneuvering right now between the U.S., Israel, and Hamas.
Right now, we have a three-way game of chicken going on, with Israel sort of using the threat of the Rafah operation to try to get Hamas to agree to this, temporary ceasefire that it would like, not a permanent one that Hamas wants. And we are now playing a game of chicken with the Israelis about not conducting a massive operation in Gaza.
Let's bring in Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute at Arizona State University. Evelyn, it's great to have you back on Balance of Power. We know for a fact that Israel has been shelling Rafah now for a couple of weeks. They now also control the gates along the Egyptian border. The president here is trying to affect the outcome of this invasion, but can't we admit here that the invasion of Rafah has already begun?
Yeah, Joe, thanks for having me back on again. Absolutely. I mean, it has begun. And I think what President Biden's trying to do is, put an end to it, to get the Israelis to change their minds, change their tactics, frankly, by using the influence that we have, which is the fact that we are providing arms to them. And I want to just say, people are saying, they're criticizing President Biden, saying he's not supporting Israel. He is supporting Israel. He's just saying, in this instance, I want you guys to take care of civilian casualties and not to use indiscriminate force.
Well, and there's a question of what Israel might interpret this action to be versus what the action actually is in terms of offensive and defensive weaponry. This is something we spoke about earlier today with Carmel Arbit of the Atlantic Council. Just take a listen to what she told us. We'll have you respond.
What the U.S. has done in its rhetoric is it has differentiated defensive munitions from offensive ones. But in many cases, Israel is using this type of bombs and weaponry to go after Hamas's terrorist infrastructure. And so from an Israeli perspective, there's no differentiation. From a U.S. perspective, there's a very clear differentiation.
So, Evelyn, is there a case to be made that for Israel, offense is defense if you're trying to eradicate Hamas and make sure something like October 7th can't happen again?
I mean, Kylie, I think there is a defense. Obviously, all of the munitions that go into keeping the Iron Dome going, because that's protecting the civilians. You know, it's a dome over the country of Israel and the civilians. The offensive weaponry, the artillery, the heavy bombs, I mean, those are clearly being used offensively, not defensively. And those are the things that it sounds like President Biden has blocked so far. But he is signaling, you know, that Israel is not getting a blank check. Again, we are, of course, Israel's ally, but because we provide Israel with so much support, we have the right to, you know, make certain demands upon the government.
We've been trying to delineate about what it is, which weapons we're talking about specifically here, Evelyn. You're helping us do that. Of course, the supplemental emergency budget that just passed and the president signed into law has to do with replenishing the Iron Dome and other defensive measures. The shipment that was stopped includes 1,800 2,000-pound bombs, 1,700 500-pound bombs. And the one that is being reviewed right now includes more than 6,000 what are called joint direct attack munitions, which essentially make dumb bombs smart. In this case, adding precision-guided technology to these bombs. Wouldn't that, in fact, give the IDF more opportunity to strike with precision and limit civilian casualties?
Yeah, Joe, I mean, that might be a case of where the administration got a little too far ahead of themselves. But, you know, I think the bigger point to make is that, you know, over 34,000 people, according to the Palestinian officials, and nobody has another lower figure to offer. It's certainly in the thousands. Innocent civilians, mostly children, have died. Yes, Israel needs to defend itself and eradicate the Hamas terrorists, but the way that it's going about it has caused an artificial famine in Gaza, in the north for sure, and of course that will only spread with time, and incredible suffering of innocent people. So the administration is saying we don't want to be complicit, frankly, in the outcome of, you know, what has happened as a result of Israel's military tactics and operations. So the administration is saying, while we support your effort to eradicate the terrorists, and while we support the effort to come up with a ceasefire agreement, we need to put pressure on Israel to conduct its operations in a way that is as precise as possible, minimizes the damage to civilians as much as possible. And frankly, I think we're also trying to put pressure on President Netanyahu to negotiate in good faith, because I'm sure, you know, I haven't talked to anyone in the White House, but there must be questions about whether President Netanyahu is actually working in good faith, whether he wants, Prime Minister rather, whether he wants to be negotiating an end to this war at all, given the fact that he politically will face a challenge as soon as the war ends.
Well, we heard from Netanyahu today. He posted on X saying that if Israel needs to stand alone, it will stand alone, that they will fight tooth and nail. Evelyn, does it seem like we're getting closer to Israel agreeing to a ceasefire?
Yeah, no. And that's another thing, Kylie. He talked about, you know, we will fight hand to hand. You know, we'll use our fingernails. I mean, I think that he went even further than what you just said. And, you know, yes, I'm sure the Israeli people feel frustrated and they feel angry and they feel rightfully, you know, that they want to put an end to the threat on that border. But the reality is that that's not the way to get security for the Israeli people. Conducting this war, continuing the war in the way that they are right now isn't going to help. And frankly, you know, what we're hearing is that the number of hostages, you know, it's no longer what we expected, over 100 hostages. There may be far fewer right now because hostages are also dying under these conditions. So I think Netanyahu's position, I'm not sure whether it's, you know, widely supported by the Israeli people or not. I think that's hard to ascertain. But clearly it's in the U.S. interest to bring this conflict, this phase of the conflict, this bloody conflict, to an end as fast as possible. We have other issues that we need to deal with.
Evelyn, it's great to have you back. Evelyn Farkas with us on Balance of Power. Coming up, the head of the FDIC under fire after a scathing investigation finds the agency rife with issues that we'll hear about next, live from Capitol Hill, where lawmakers are calling for a change from the banking regulator. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
let me be clear that an abusive and toxic workplace environment where people feel that they are being abused in some way that is hostile to the work environment is intolerable. And one way or the other, it will have to be addressed.
Senator Raphael Warnock, the Democrat from Georgia, speaking with us this time yesterday on the scrutiny that FDIC head Martin Gruenberg is now facing after an independent report this week detailed widespread sexual harassment and discrimination at the agency. It found Gruenberg's conduct was not a root cause of the issues, but suggests, quote, culture starts at the top, unquote. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall spoke with lawmakers today about the regulator's future and joins us now from Capitol Hill. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe, I spent today speaking with members of the Senate Banking Committee, which has oversight of the FDIC, and lawmakers told me they're starting to set up in-person private meetings with Martin Gruenberg in the wake of this report. As you know, he's been at the FDIC since 2005, and he's led the agency for 10 of the last 13 years. Let's listen to some of the competing views happening here on Capitol Hill about the future of the chair at the agency.
I believe the buck stops with him, and he's going to have to answer for it.
I think it is important that we have a chairman at the FDIC, Marty Gruenberg, who has said that he accepts the findings of this report, and he already has a plan in place to be able to make changes at the agency. So I have complete confidence in him.
Sometimes when somebody's been in a particular administrative position for a long time, whether they've done anything wrong or not, it helps to actually have a fresh set of eyes. So.
In a statement to staff, the chair said the FDIC will start implementing changes to follow the report's recommendations, adding, quote, I am ultimately responsible for everything that happens at our agency, including our workplace culture. Questions are being raised about how a potential shakeup could affect banking regulation under the Biden administration. Gruenberg is part of a 3-2 majority Democrats hold on the FDIC board. This could affect proposals the agency has championed, such as a plan for regulatory hurdles for bank mergers or another proposal known as Basel III Endgame, which would change capital requirements for some of the largest banks. Now, Gruenberg is expected to be here on Capitol Hill next week. He'll appear before the Senate Banking Committee and face a lot of those lawmakers that you just heard from. He'll then also head to the House and be in front of House Financial Services. Joe and Kaylee, these were pre-scheduled hearings with regulators, but there is no doubt that this report will be a highlight.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, thank you so much, reporting live tonight from Capitol Hill. Up next on Balance of Power, Libby Cantrill of Pimco. This is Bloomberg.
I don't know who's going to be the president, but Trump's promising a 10% tariff across the board, which is a giant tax increase on American consumers. Everybody's going to fight China. A Biden presidency is going to fight China. A Trump presidency is going to fight China. The question is, what about the other countries? The frustration for me is neither of these two presidents want to do trade agreements.
That was former Speaker of the House Paul Ryan earlier this week at the Milken Conference, where he shared his thoughts on what the impact of the 2024 election might be on trade. Joining us now, Libby Cantrill, Pimco Managing Director and Head of Public Policy. Libby, always great to have you here on Balance of Power. So when we consider what trade policy, and let's keep it narrow specifically to China, would look like under a second Biden administration versus a second Trump administration, how big is the difference really?
Yeah, well, good to be with you, Kaylee. So in some ways there are some similarities. I think that both President Biden and former President Trump lean a little bit protectionistic. I do think that they have different approaches, though, to economic tariffs. Of course, President Biden has kept on those 25% tariffs on about $350 billion of goods that Trump had put on back in 2018. So he's just kept those on. And then he's also used both tariffs but also export controls and other sort of tools of economic statecraft, if you will, in order to advance national security goals. So I think we would expect more of the same under under a Biden administration, maybe a ratcheting up on the edges of in terms of tensions with China, but not necessarily a strategic use of tariffs, which is really where Trump comes in. And that he has a different approach, where he believes in tariffs. He will point to the fact that the goods trade deficit with China has declined about $140 billion since we started putting those tariffs on. And as he has said, and I think that investors are wrong to doubt him, that he will put on a 60% tariff on China. Now, does he put a 60% tariff on all Chinese imports coming into the United States? I mean, we'll see. But I do think that folks sort of dismiss his views on trade at their own peril. He believes in tariffs. He's been talking about tariffs since the 1980s. This is a long-held view. And again, I think folks should not doubt that the tariffs will be going up, probably under either administration.
Fascinating. We spoke just last week, Libby, with Virginia's Governor Glenn Youngkin had this to say on Bloomberg about the issue of tariffs. Let's listen to what he said. We'll have you respond.
Of course, the issue of tariffs is something that was used effectively back in the Trump administration in establishing a real recognition that China was competing unfairly. China continues to compete unfairly, and it needs to be combated. And that's why the deep relationship with trusted allies is so important.
It's pretty remarkable, Libby. You talk about what investors actually believe or not believe, specifically from Donald Trump. The fact of the matter is tariffs would have been a curse word in Republican politics before Donald Trump, right? Is this now part of the Republican platform?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Joe. I mean, I do think that in many ways, this is the party of Trump. He has changed the ideology, particularly around trade. But of course, that's also dovetailed with the fact that President Xi in China has employed some of these economic practices, whether it's IP theft or what have you. So I think that it's been kind of a collision of these two things: Trump ascending to being the leader of the Republican Party, plus a more, arguably restrictive of China in terms of economic practices. So yes, I think that to Glenn Youngkin's point, though, Trump has a different view here, right? He views that tariffs are important, but he also includes our allies in that equation. And I think this is the other thing that folks might be dismissing, is this idea of a baseline tariff. President Trump is campaigning on this idea of a 10% kind of across-the-board tariff on both our kind of enemies and our allies. And I do think that has implications, particularly if he's going to tariff places like Mexico, which, of course, the U.S. is highly reliant on in terms of supply chains, and obviously has implications for inflation as well.
Well, Libby, as we consider what potential policy could look like, again, under a Trump administration or another Biden term for that matter, none of that is really until January, although I guess we might be able to start pricing some things in until November. What about between now and then? Congress has done basically all the big bills it needs to do. Government's funded, at least for the time being. The supplemental passed. Is that all we're going to get?
Yeah, I don't think we are going to get much more from Congress. Of course, we saw the headlines around the motion to vacate, the unsuccessful motion to vacate of Speaker Johnson yesterday. But outside of that, Kayleigh, in terms of our discussions with clients, no one's talking about at Congress. No one's asking about what they may or may not do, because there are very few critical things right now that Congress needs to do. Of course, they'll need to pass another funding bill at the end of September. We expect that probably will be in the form of a continuing resolution past the election, but that remains to be seen. But outside of that, just no real big inflection point from a market's perspective. Again, all of our clients are just asking about the horse race, the down ballot races, and then sort of moving into kind of what the possible economic implications are.
So gridlock is good, is back on Wall Street, at least, I guess, for the summer, maybe the fall, Libby. And to your point, the markets are looking toward the election now. Everyone goes underground on Capitol Hill, certainly, to campaign for the summer. The presidential campaign is well underway at this point. Goldman Sachs was out with an interesting warning today, specifically David Kostin, the chief U.S. equity strategist, about what might happen with indecision on election night, that we may not know the next day or days after, with recounts possible, legal action possible. To what extent Do you worry about a market risk in November?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that is a risk, and clearly, we saw some of that play out in 2020, and I do think that certainly could happen. 2024 will be a little bit different, just because, of course, in 2020 everyone was voting in the midst of COVID, and that meant that many more people were voting via absentee ballot than probably they will this election cycle, and that did lead to some questions about election legitimacy and what have you. So clearly it is clearly a risk. What we're guiding clients, so Joe, is this is going to be a close race. I mean, we would say that the White House is basically a toss-up at this point. Polling it's too early, though, on the national level in particular. This will likely come down to the same 6 states that determined the 2020 election. And so if those states are close, then sure, that we may not know the election result come November 6th. So we'll just have to wait and see. I think that the bigger risk is just in terms of a policy perspective, the risk that whomever ascends the White House, A, doesn't have a very strong mandate, but B, half the population doesn't believe that person is the legitimate president. So I think that could undermine their policy ability, making ability, but then also just sort of the credibility of the office of the presidency.
Finally, Libby, I'm not sure if you've seen, but there was some reporting out of the Washington Post today about a meeting that Donald Trump apparently had with a bunch of oil executives at Mar-a-Lago, telling them that if they collectively contributed $1 billion to his campaign, that he would basically overturn all of President Biden's environmental mandates, other regulations that the energy sector feels like are getting in the way. I'm not sure if you have a thought on what the actual ethics of that exchange would be, but also isn't Donald Trump likely to do a lot of that anyway, regardless of whether or not the energy companies provide $1 billion for his campaign?
Yes. I mean, look, this is not necessarily surprising. I think exactly to your point, this is expected. And in some ways, even though maybe despite the policy environment, of course, traditional oil and is in terms of production is at its all-time highs here in the United States. The same thing can be said for LNG. But the policy environment hasn't been particularly favorable for those sectors under a Biden administration. And clearly they're trying to ratchet up regulations in this sort of 11th hour of the administration. But so we are expecting that sort of day one, President Trump will likely unravel a lot of those executive orders that Biden has put into place in terms of drilling on federal lands, in terms of the LNG export pause. So to your point, no real news here. I'm sure that those CEOs probably weren't that surprised that he was saying that. I think they'd be surprised if he intended to do something different. But again, he's using it as an opportunity to fundraise, not surprisingly.
Libby, it's always great to have you. Libby Cantrill at Pimco, we thank you for being with us again on Bloomberg. Coming up, Stormy Daniels wrapping her testimony in Donald Trump's hush money trial in New York. We'll dare to go there next with our political panel. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
There's no politician in the history of the country that people know more about than Donald Trump. I think the media's covered him obsessively for the past 7 years. So the idea that there's some new bombshell that's going to shake people's confidence or change their opinion on Donald Trump is pretty preposterous.
Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, the Republican, talking with us today on another day of testimony in Donald Trump's New York criminal trial. Joining us now is our political panel. Matt Gorman is back, targeted victory vice president, alongside Christy Setzer, president and founder of New Heights Communications. It's great to have both of you with us. Matt, did Stormy Daniels help or hurt the prosecution's case?
We'll find out. I mean, it's certainly between her and Michael Cohen. They seem to be reaping what they've sown over the last couple of years, giving lots of interviews, giving lots of fodder for the defense, talking about they don't hate Trump, want to see him go to jail, this and that. And so between this and then with the Michael Cohen really cross-examination, in large parts, what this trial is going to come down to.
Well, understanding that you both aren't necessarily legal analysts, and I won't pretend to be as well. I never went to law school. But politically, Christy, we've had so much conversation as to whether or not a guilty verdict makes a difference in the vote in November. But what if the actual verdict itself doesn't matter as much as what was said in the courtroom? Has already damage been done to Trump's candidacy because of the salacious testimony of Stormy Daniels?
I think that's exactly right. I think the damage is being done right now. And I think the reason why is because this contest has become about the so-called double haters, the people who don't like Donald Trump and they don't like Joe Biden. But that's actually worked a little bit to Donald Trump's advantage, which is to say that he hasn't been as in the public spotlight. Of course, he has been. He's Donald Trump. But as he had been when he was president in several years now. So people who don't like either of them are now getting to remember on a day-to-day, hour-by-hour basis what it is that they didn't like about him, which is the spectacle, the crimes, but most importantly, the way that he is towards women. So Stormy Daniels' case reminds them of E. Jean Carroll. It reminds them of the fact that he has been convicted of sexual assault. And again, in this context right now where we're talking about abortion and the sort of existential rights of women over their bodily autonomy, I just don't think it helps them very much.
We're talking about such a small sliver of the electorate that these two men are fighting over. Everything Christy just said, how does Donald Trump get ahead of that without just saying the same thing every day in court?
I think a couple things. I think in large part the challenge is for Democrats to, try and make a case against the Trump presidency when it seems that polls show people feel a little better about the Trump presidency when compared to the Biden presidency, when you compare the 4 years against the 4 years. Mm-hmm. That's number two. But I also feel like sometimes the Biden campaign and others get in this mode where, I worked for Jeb Bush in 2015, 2016. Some of the talking points they used, I could have used when I was writing Jeb's talking points, right? So how do you convince voters of these sorts of things when they're not already priced in? Now, to Christy's point, the one thing that has changed, though, in the intervening 2 years is the issue of abortion. Now, that has been fruitful for Democrats to use in the past. Now, the issue is, does immigration and abortion kind of counteract each other? And then what you're left with is the economy and other things. That's what I'm curious about.
Well, the economy and other things, perhaps like Israel policy, because, of course, last night, Joe Biden gave an interview to CNN in which he suggested that the U.S. could withhold further arms shipments to Israel if they move into Rafah. Has he just dug the problem hole of Israel deeper for himself? Because already you had the left angry because you haven't done enough to this point. Now the right is angry because you're potentially being seen, at least optically, walking away from what is supposed to be an ironclad U.S. alliance.
No, I think it's smart. I think it was sort of a measured response that basically acknowledges that Israel is and has been a long time and strong ally of the United States, and also that there is a limit, right? That we're not going to support Netanyahu regardless of what he does. So I think it's both smart politically as well as sort of substantively, because it basically gives a little bit of what the left wants right now, which is, frankly, of course, I think reasonable, a permanent ceasefire, and then to stop giving weapons aid to Israel. So he's sort of towing that line a little bit right now in a way that I think makes him palatable to a broader portion of the electorate, not a more narrow one.
But short of a ceasefire, though, the pro-Palestinian protests that he's been facing are going to continue, aren't they?
They're going to continue, and I think the question is for how long, right? Right now, like literally today, we're still seeing it on college campuses and probably will, of course, for another week or so until most schools have had their commencement ceremonies. What he needs to make sure is that this stops well ahead of the conventions, right? So he's basically got this window of the next couple of months where we need to see significant progress towards a ceasefire. Or, of course, there's going to be protests regardless of the conventions, but they're going to be much more serious for him if there's not progress before then.
Well, and then, of course, after the conventions, it's a question of whether or not these people who are protesting are going to be willing to vote for him in November. It was brought up to me earlier this week that the people who are protesting around Palestine and Gaza policy are not very likely to go vote for Donald Trump, because Donald Trump would probably be similar, if not more, even more stringent in terms of supporting Israel than Joe Biden. It's a turnout issue at the end of the day, right, Matt?
Completely, it is. And especially because you don't have RFK trying to appeal to these folks. So it is absolutely a turnout issue in places like Michigan where they need...
Where RFK is on the ballot.
Absolutely. And there's an uncommitted slice of voters there. And in Wisconsin, we've already seen it from the Democratic primary. So, look, these people are very well defined. You're playing with a very small pool of voters. As J.D. Vance alluded to, these are some of the most well-defined people who've ever run for president. So it really matters, those folks who turn out and those who don't.
Guess we'll see come November. And we'll see more from our political panel coming up as we look to a neck-and-neck race for Senate in Maryland and other states that are going to be crucial to deciding the balance of the upper chamber, like Ohio and Pennsylvania. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I'm proud to have endorsed her. She's the best candidate to run against Larry Hogan in the general election. And it's unfortunate that the Trone campaign decided to go negative. I think she's going to do very well, first in the primary, and then she's going to go on and win the general, because I think Maryland voters recognize that a vote for Larry Hogan is a vote to put Republicans in charge of the United States Senate.
That was Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, a Democrat, on the race for the other Senate seat in his state. Back with us now, our political panel, Matt Gorman, Targeted Victory Vice President, and Christy Setzer, President and founder of New Heights Communications. Of course, this primary in which Angela Alsobrooks is up against David Trone is on Tuesday, the 14th. And according to the latest Emerson polling that we've gotten, Christy, they are literally in a dead heat. 42% right now for Angela Alsobrooks, 41% for David Trone, and both of them in this polling beat Larry Hogan in a hypothetical matchup come November. So is this really about who can beat Larry Hogan, if they both can?
They both can. There's a couple different arguments I think that could be made. Obviously, the point in David Trone's favor is that he's a self-funder, that they can sort of not have to worry about the race in that way. Where the argument for Angela Alsobrooks is the fact that, frankly, as a black woman in a Senate that doesn't have a whole lot of them, that she is able to sort of appeal to a different demographic in a state like Maryland, where there's a significant portion of the vote that obviously is black, but also, again, in a year when we're talking about abortion and issues that we're hoping will really bring women to the polls. So they both actually have, like a pretty decent argument to make, but kind of on balance, I would think that Alsobrooks is a slightly better candidate.
Matt, I thought that Larry Hogan was the unicorn. He was the exception, the Republican who could actually turn a state like Maryland Republican in the Senate because he was so popular as a governor. This was Democrats' worst fears. He's losing by double digits, to Kaylee's point, to both Democratic candidates.
Yeah, I'm curious to see if that's an outlier, because candidate, that's the first poll that shows him losing, and the other polls show him not just winning, but winning by about 6 to 12 points. So it's quite a flip.
So you think Maryland turns red in this Senate race?
I'll say this. I wouldn't be surprised, number one. Number two, resources are finite. So the more time we're talking about Maryland Senate right now, 6 months ago we would never dream about.
You're right.
So that also counts for money. Ohio and Montana are really where the Senate's going to go through right now. So the more money that's being spent in Maryland from either side, that's money that's not being spent in Ohio and Montana. More than anything else, though, watch the political splits, right? So obviously Maryland's going to go Democratic, but they could go Republican. The only other time in 2020, there's one other candidate who was able to flip the presidential trend, Susan Collins in Maryland. That's something that's been going down in recent years. In 2000, there's 10 of them. So it's something to watch this year.
Well, in Pennsylvania, we got new polling this week that suggests Biden is behind Trump, but Bob Casey, the Democrat, is well ahead.
Yeah.
So is Pennsylvania going to be the state in which we see the effect that Matt was just talking about?
Yeah, that's possible, right? I mean, I do think that right now it's pretty clear. There's been a number of polls about the race. Casey's been ahead in all of them, somewhere between, 4 points, I think, in this latest one, all the way up to he had a 17-point advantage in a poll last month. So Casey's in good shape, but we've seen the polling. We know that Joe Biden is in Pennsylvania, kind of it's a toss-up there right now. However, I am from Pennsylvania. I can tell you that in the same way that Ohio kind of leans red ultimately, Pennsylvania ultimately kind of leans blue. All you really need to look at is the counties outside of Philadelphia to know that it will be very hard for Trump to win that
Maybe
state.
some reverse coattails there from Casey to Biden.
That's
As a
right,
Democrat, what keeps you up at night, Ohio or Montana?
Oh, that's a good question. If I have to guess, I will say Ohio.
Sounds like
and
both.
it is kind of both, but I think it's more Ohio, actually, and not because Sherrod Brown is not an amazing and phenomenal person in Ohio who has represented him for a long time, is such a known quantity, but just because the way that the state has been trending, it's been significant.
Not true. Great conversation. Christy Setzer, Matt Gorman, great to have both of you with us at the table. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter for all the stories that we've been talking about this hour on the terminal and online.
And we'll be back with much more tomorrow. So thank you so much for joining us. And please come back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio.